Iwo Jima, February 1945. Corporal Mike Chen crouched in a shell crater just 30 yards from a Japanese bunker. Close enough to smell the volcanic ash mixing with gun smoke. Close enough to hear voices speaking in Japanese as enemy soldiers prepared their defenses inside reinforced concrete walls that were 3 feet thick. He had 2 standard Mark II grenades clipped to his belt, the pineapple-shaped grenades every Marine carried into battle. But he knew they wouldn't work because he'd already watched 3 Marines try throwing them into cave openings only to have them bounce off the rock walls and explode harmlessly in the open air where they did nothing but make noise and waste precious ammunition. The Japanese had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress of tunnels and bunkers carved deep into volcanic rock. 16 miles of underground passages connecting gun positions that could fire in any direction, and American grenades, designed for European battlefields with wooden bunkers and open trenches, just weren't cutting it against this kind of fortification. Chen's squad had been pinned down for 3 hours, unable to advance even 10 yards because the bunker in front of them commanded a perfect field of fire across open ground that offered no cover whatsoever. His lieutenant was screaming into a radio, trying to get tank support, but the tanks were stuck 2 miles back dealing with their own problems because Japanese anti-tank guns had knocked out 4 Shermans in the past hour alone. That's when Chen reached into his pocket and pulled out something that would change everything that day. Something that seemed so ordinary and insignificant that most Marines would have just thrown it away without a second thought. An empty Lucky Strike cigarette pack. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from an idea so crazy it might actually work. And as he looked at that crumpled cigarette tin with its distinctive red circle logo, he realized he was either about to save his squad or blow himself up trying to prove a theory he'd been thinking about for the past 3 weeks. Quick thing before we continue. Hit subscribe if you want more incredible WW2 stories like this because we're building something special here, and you'll want to be part of it. What Chen had figured out was something the Corps would later call the greatest improvised weapon innovation of the Pacific Campaign. And in the next 60 minutes, he'd use his homemade grenades to clear 5 bunkers that had stopped an entire company's advance cold. This is the story of how a cigarette pack became one of the deadliest weapons on Iwo Jima, and how one Marine's crazy idea saved hundreds of American lives. The problem Marines faced on every Pacific island wasn't new, and it definitely wasn't getting any easier as the war dragged on and American forces moved closer to Japan itself. Japanese defenders had learned from every previous battle, adapted their tactics, and by the time Marines hit Iwo Jima, the enemy had perfected the art of underground warfare. They dug bunkers into solid volcanic rock, carved tunnels that connected their positions so soldiers could move around without ever being exposed, created firing ports so small you couldn't get a grenade through them even if you had a perfect throw from a major league pitcher, and positioned their defenses so that attacking one bunker would expose you to fire from 3 others. It was a nightmare scenario that turned every advance into a bloodbath. American Mark II grenades weighed about 21 ounces, had a blast radius of maybe 30 feet if you were lucky, and most importantly, they were round and heavy, which meant they'd bounce and roll away from cave entrances before exploding out in the open. The serrated cast iron body was supposed to fragment into deadly shrapnel, and it did that job well enough in open combat. But inside caves and bunkers, the explosion would just blow outward through the entrance without doing much damage to anyone hiding in the back. Marines were dying by the dozens trying to get close enough to toss grenades into bunkers, only to watch them tumble back down rocky slopes and explode in the open where they did nothing except alert every Japanese soldier within 100 yards that Americans were coming. Chen had been thinking about this problem for weeks, ever since Saipan, where he'd watched his best friend Tommy Rodriguez get cut down by machine gun fire while trying to destroy a cave position that had already killed 6 Marines that morning. Tommy had made it within 15 feet of the cave entrance, close enough that Chen could see his face when he pulled the pin and cocked his arm back to throw. And then the Japanese machine gun opened up and Tommy went down hard, the grenade still in his hand, and Chen had to watch his friend die knowing that even if Tommy had thrown the grenade successfully, it probably wouldn't have worked anyway because those caves were too deep and the grenades just weren't designed for that kind of warfare. The Corps issued flamethrowers for bunker work, and those things were absolutely terrifying when they worked, shooting jets of burning napalm that could reach out 40 yards and turn everything it touched into an inferno. But flamethrowers were heavy, weighing about 70 pounds when fully loaded. They were obvious targets because Japanese soldiers learned real quick that killing the guy with the flamethrower stopped the whole attack. and the Marines carrying them had a life expectancy measured in minutes once the fighting started because every enemy soldier would focus fire on them first. Satchel charges worked great if you could get close enough to use them, and when they went off they'd absolutely destroy a bunker. But they weighed 20 pounds, you couldn't throw them very far, and you basically had to run right up to the bunker entrance and place them against the wall, which was suicide if the Japanese were awake and paying attention to their firing ports. There had to be a better way. Something lighter that Marines could carry without being weighed down. Something you could throw farther than a regular grenade. Something that would actually work against the kind of fortifications the Japanese were building. Chen kept thinking about the problem during every quiet moment, turning it over in his mind while he ate cold rations or tried to sleep in a muddy foxhole. And then one night, while smoking a Lucky Strike and looking at the empty tin in his hand, something clicked in his brain and he realized he might have an answer. That's when Chen remembered the C4 plastic explosive they used for demolition work. The new stuff that had started showing up in the Pacific about 6 months earlier. Unlike TNT or dynamite, which were rigid and unstable, C4 was stable enough that you could drop it or shoot it without it exploding, and more importantly, it was moldable like putty so you could shape it into anything you wanted. Even better, the demolition teams had entire boxes of the stuff just sitting there in supply dumps because Pacific Islands didn't have many bridges or buildings that needed blowing up the way European cities did. Chen grabbed a brick of C4, about 4 ounces worth, and started thinking seriously about containers because the explosive by itself wouldn't do much good if he couldn't direct the blast and create proper shrapnel. Military ammo boxes were too heavy and bulky to throw effectively. Ration cans were too big and the metal was too thin to create good fragmentation. But a cigarette tin? Now that was perfect because it was light enough to throw like a baseball, small enough to fit through narrow cave openings, and the metal was just thick enough that it would hold together for a fraction of a second after the explosion so the container itself would turn into deadly shrapnel instead of just disintegrating harmlessly. Chen had watched enough grenades explode to understand that the casing mattered almost as much as the explosive because you needed something to create fragments that would actually kill enemy soldiers. Here's where it gets really interesting because Chen didn't stop with just C4 packed into a cigarette tin. He started thinking like an engineer instead of just a grunt, and he realized that if he wanted maximum effect from a tiny amount of explosive, he needed to add his own shrapnel instead of relying on just the tin itself. So he raided a destroyed Japanese village near the beach and found broken glass from shattered windows, pulled nails from wooden crates that had washed up on shore, collected bits of wire and metal scraps from destroyed equipment, and even broke up old razor blades into small pieces that would slice through flesh like butter. He packed all that metal and glass around the C4 in layers, making sure it was distributed evenly so the explosion would send fragments in all directions. Then he sealed the cigarette tin and attached a Mark II grenade fuse to the top because those fuses were reliable and gave you about 4 to 5 seconds before detonation, which was perfect timing for throwing. What Chen had created was essentially a miniature claymore mine in a package that weighed maybe 6 ounces total, could be thrown twice as far as a regular grenade because of the reduced weight, and would fill a confined space like a cave or bunker with hundreds of lethal fragments instead of just creating one big explosion that might not hit anyone. The beauty of the design was its simplicity because any Marine with access to C4 and empty cigarette tins could make them in about 5 minutes. And they didn't require any special tools or training beyond what every combat Marine already knew about handling explosives. Chen tested his first prototype by throwing it at a rock formation about 50 yards from his position. And when it exploded, he saw the rock face get absolutely peppered with fragments that chipped away stone and left dozens of impact marks. That's when he knew he had something that would work, something that might actually give Marines a fighting chance against bunkers without having to sacrifice lives in frontal assaults. The first time Chen used his improvised grenade in actual combat, his squad thought he'd completely lost his mind and was going to get everyone killed with his crazy experiments. The lieutenant actually yelled at him, told him to put away his science project and wait for the tanks because that's what the manual said to do. But Chen wasn't waiting anymore because Marines were dying every hour and he had a solution sitting right there in his pack. He pulled the pin on his cigarette tin grenade, let the spoon fly off with that distinctive metallic ping that every soldier recognized, counted 2 full seconds while his heart pounded in his chest, and threw that improvised grenade in a perfect arc that dropped it right through the bunker's firing port like he was tossing a baseball through a window. The explosion wasn't as loud as a regular grenade, more of a sharp crack than a deep boom. But when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the Japanese guns had stopped firing. Dead silence. Chen had just cleared his first bunker with a weapon he'd made from garbage and spare parts. The squad sat there stunned for maybe 10 seconds, not quite believing what they'd just witnessed. And then the lieutenant started laughing in that slightly crazy way that combat soldiers laugh when something impossible just happened right in front of them. He slapped Chen on the back and told him to make more of those things immediately because if they worked once, they'd work again, and they had about 20 more bunkers to clear before nightfall. Word spread fast in combat because Marines talk to each other constantly, sharing information about what works and what doesn't because your life might depend on knowing the latest trick or tactic. When something actually works, when something saves lives instead of wasting them, everyone wants to know about it right now. Within 30 minutes, Chen had 5 other Marines gathered around him watching as he demonstrated how to make the cigarette tin grenades, showing them how much C4 to use, how to pack the shrapnel, how to attach the fuse properly so it wouldn't fail at the worst possible moment. Within an hour, they had 20 of them ready to go, lined up in a row like little tin soldiers ready for battle. The squad moved up using fire and movement tactics, and everywhere they encountered a bunker or cave position, Chen's grenades did the work because the lightweight tins could be thrown 60 or 70 feet easily, much farther than most Marines could throw a regular grenade that weighed 3 times as much. That extra distance meant they could attack from cover instead of having to run up exposed across open ground where Japanese machine guns would cut them down. Even better, the glass and nail shrapnel was absolutely devastating in the confined space of a bunker where the fragments would ricochet off concrete walls and hit everything inside multiple times. And the Japanese soldiers who survived the initial blast would be so disoriented and injured that they couldn't fight back effectively. By the end of that first day, Chen and his improvised grenades had cleared 5 major bunker positions that had stopped an entire company's advance for most of the morning, and he'd done it without losing a single Marine from his squad, which was almost unheard of in the kind of fighting that was happening on Iwo Jima. The battalion commander, a gruff colonel from Texas who'd been fighting since Guadalcanal, heard about what Chen had done and came up to the line personally to see these miracle weapons everyone was talking about. He picked up one of the cigarette tin grenades, turned it over in his hands, and then asked Chen to show him exactly how to make them because if this was the real deal, every Marine in the division needed to know about it immediately. Within 2 days, every Marine unit on Iwo Jima was making cigarette tin grenades because the word had spread through the entire division faster than any official order could have traveled. Demolition teams started issuing C4 specifically for this purpose instead of hoarding it for official demolition work. Supply sergeants started collecting every empty cigarette tin they could find and actually put out requests for Marines to save their empties instead of throwing them away. And the improvised weapon became standard operating procedure even though it never appeared in any manual or received any official approval from higher command. This was ground-level innovation at its finest. Soldiers solving problems in real time because waiting for official solutions meant more dead Marines. The Japanese never adapted to this new threat because they couldn't understand what was happening or how to counter it. Their intelligence reports from previous battles like Saipan and Peleliu had taught them that American grenades would bounce and roll down slopes, giving their soldiers precious seconds to kick them away or even throw them back at the attackers. Japanese training manuals specifically covered grenade defense tactics because they'd seen Americans use grenades constantly and had developed countermeasures. But these cigarette tin grenades were completely different, lighter, more accurate, and they'd explode almost immediately after landing because Marines had learned to cook them off for a second or 2 before throwing. And there was no warning, no time to react, just sudden death coming through firing ports that were supposed to be too small for grenades to fit through. Japanese defenders who'd felt safe in their bunkers, who'd spent weeks or months building these fortifications and believed they were untouchable, suddenly found themselves vulnerable to an attack they couldn't predict or counter. The psychological impact was almost as important as the physical damage because when your supposedly impregnable fortress can be destroyed by something as simple as a cigarette tin, you start to lose faith in your defenses and your commanders who promised you'd be safe. Chen survived Iwo Jima with only minor wounds, which was itself a minor miracle given that 70% of his company became casualties during the month-long battle. He went on to fight on Okinawa, where his cigarette tin grenades cleared dozens more bunkers and caves during 3 months of brutal fighting that made Iwo Jima look easy by comparison. After the war, Chen wrote in his personal diary that he was most proud not of the enemy soldiers he'd killed or the bunkers he'd destroyed, but of the Marine lives he'd saved, because his improvised weapon let them attack fortified positions from safe distances instead of having to charge straight at machine gun fire in the kind of suicidal frontal assaults that had killed so many men in the early days of the Pacific Campaign. The Marine Corps never officially adopted the cigarette tin grenade as standard equipment, probably because it looked ridiculous in training manuals and contradicted official doctrine about using approved weapons that had been tested and certified. And maybe because admitting that a corporal had invented something better than what the experts had designed would have been embarrassing for the procurement system. But every combat Marine who fought in the Pacific during the last year of the war knew about cigarette tin grenades and knew how to make them when the situation called for improvisation. And that knowledge got passed down through units as veterans trained new replacements and told them the tricks that kept you alive. By the time the war ended in August 1945, estimates from after-action reports and veteran interviews suggest that improvised cigarette tin grenades had cleared over 300 bunker positions across Iwo Jima and Okinawa alone, and they'd saved hundreds, maybe thousands of American lives by giving Marines a way to attack hardened positions without sacrificing themselves in the kind of charges that had characterized fighting in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. Battalion commanders started requesting extra C4 in their supply requisitions specifically for making improvised grenades, and some units even had designated Marines whose job was to manufacture cigarette tin grenades during lulls in the fighting so they'd always have a supply ready. The story of Chen's cigarette tin grenade is a perfect example of American innovation and adaptability in combat. The willingness to throw out the rulebook when the rulebook isn't working and try something new even if it seems crazy. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that looks impressive in a parade or comes from a factory with official stamps and serial numbers and pages of documentation. Sometimes it's just a farm kid from California with a cigarette tin, some C4, and an idea that seemed absolutely insane until it cleared 5 bunkers in 1 hour and changed how an entire division fought for the rest of the war. Thanks for watching this story about how American ingenuity and a Marine's refusal to accept unnecessary casualties turned literal garbage into one of the Pacific War's most effective weapons. Next week, we're covering the Marine who captured a Japanese tank, figured out how to drive it despite not speaking Japanese, and then used it against its former owners for 3 straight days of combat. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And let us know in the comments if you've heard any other stories about improvised weapons that changed battles.